It was shortly past 5 in the morning when a farmer noticed something wrong. Tire marks pressed into the gravel. His field gate was hanging open, the padlock snapped clean off. He followed the fresh tracks, cutting through the grass toward the riverbank. What he found there would stay with him forever. A man's body, face down in the shallows, wrapped tightly inside a curtain. No identification on him. No shoes, just a broken body lying motionless in the water. The evidence of what had happened to him was written across every inch of his frame. He had been beaten savagely, and he hadn't regained consciousness before the river finished what the fists had started. This is the story of Lee McKnight, and how a £2,000 debt, a carefully crafted message, and a terraced house on Charles Street in Carlisle placed him directly in the path of people who had already decided he wasn't leaving. Lee McKnight didn't fit the mold of a hardened criminal. He wasn't the type to carry a weapon or to push a situation into violence. People who knew him described him as relaxed, someone who preferred to talk his way around problems rather than escalate them. During the day, he worked shifts at the Premier Inn in Carlisle, but like many at his level, Lee had found a faster stream of income through drugs, cocaine and cannabis, bought low and sold on for a quick margin. He was one link in a much longer chain, moving small quantities and owing money upward to those who supplied him. At 26 years old, Lee had accumulated a debt he couldn't repay. Around £2,000 was owed to Jaime Davidson, a dealer operating several rungs above street level. Davidson moved bulk quantities through Carlisle and supplied smaller sellers like Lee. That debt wasn't simply unpaid, it had gone past the point where Davidson was prepared to wait. Lee was aware of the danger. In the weeks leading up to his death, he had been deliberately keeping out of sight. People close to him said he seemed scared, that he'd made comments suggesting he knew certain individuals were tracking him down. But in the world he moved in, going quiet only bought you days, not safety. What Lee had no way of knowing was that Davidson had stopped thinking about repayment entirely. He had shifted his focus to making an example. The plan taking shape wasn't about recovering money, it was about power. About reminding everyone connected to his operation what happened when debts were ignored. Lee McKnight had been selected as the message. Jaime Davidson operated with ambition above the street level. Heroin, cocaine, cannabis, he handled volume, purchasing in bulk and distributing downward to sellers like Lee. Every fortnight, Davidson himself faced payment obligations to suppliers further up the chain. By July 2020, the pressure bearing down on him from above had grown serious. The people he answered to were not the type to accept excuses. So while Davidson was chasing Lee for £2,000, he was simultaneously under his own financial threat from men with far fewer limits than himself. He understood the rules clearly. Debts within the trade had consequences, and those consequences were physical. Davidson's response was to organize something deliberate. He recruited 2 associates, Aaron Graham, 26, and Jamie Lee Roberts, who was just 17 years old at the time. Both were known to him. Roberts was already in debt to Davidson himself and was offered a straightforward arrangement, participate in what was planned, and that debt would be cleared. But before anyone could be physically reached, there was a problem. Lee McKnight was in hiding. They needed a way to pull him out without triggering his suspicion. The answer came in the form of Coral Edgar. She was someone Lee had sold to previously, a familiar face, a trusted contact. She was brought into the plan to act as the bait. The message she would send would appear entirely normal, flirtatious, inviting, and giving Lee no reason to hesitate. Davidson wasn't building a crude ambush. He was constructing a trap designed to appear like an ordinary visit, and he had chosen a location that suited the purpose perfectly. Late on the 23rd of July, Lee's phone received a message from Coral Edgar. The tone was warm, personal, with enough of a suggestion to make the invitation hard to decline. He responded and agreed to come over. The address she gave was her home on Charles Street in Carlisle. What Lee didn't know, couldn't have known, was that Jaime Davidson was already inside that house when she sent the message. Aaron Graham and Jamie Lee Roberts were there too. Coral's mother, Carol Edgar, also lived at the property. It was a household well known within the local drug scene, a regular stop, an unassuming door on a quiet street, low income, disorganized, the kind of place where unusual visitors attracted no particular attention. Just after 2:30 in the morning, Lee called a taxi. CCTV footage later captured him climbing in and giving his destination as Charles Street. He stepped through the front door at roughly 20 minutes to 3. The attack started almost the moment he was inside. There was no confrontation, no demand for the money, no warning given. The trap closed immediately. The three men began striking him in the living room and continued into the kitchen. In those first moments, Lee may have still believed this was a message, a warning meant to frighten rather than destroy. But Davidson had never intended for it to end there. The violence on Charles Street that night wasn't designed for Lee alone. It was designed for every person who owed Davidson money and might be watching. What followed over the next 2 hours was one of the most severe beatings described in a Carlisle courtroom in years. Lee McKnight was punched, kicked, and stamped on with repeated force. The forensic evidence later catalogued the scale of the damage. A fractured skull, 9 broken ribs, 36 individual injuries recorded to his head alone. A riding whip, decorated with diamante studs, was used to strike him repeatedly throughout the assault. That same whip was later recovered discarded close to the riverbank. Bruising patterns on Lee's body indicated he had been restrained at some point, likely tied to a chair, unable to move as the beating continued around him. Nobody inside that house made any attempt to stop what was happening. By the time the assault ended, Lee McKnight was unconscious. His body had absorbed damage that would have been unsurvivable even without what came next. He lay slumped and bleeding heavily, no longer able to speak or respond. But the decision had already been made that he would not be left there alive. Killing him would not be enough. They also needed to move him. Lee was wrapped inside a curtain and carried out of the house. He was loaded into the back of a black Nissan Navara parked outside, a vehicle registered to Carol Edgar, Coral's mother. Whether she gave her consent or simply chose not to intervene, her truck was used that night to transport an unconscious and critically injured man across the city of Carlisle. The group drove without urgency through streets that were largely empty at that hour. The route ended at farmland beside a river south of the city. They forced the gate open, drove across the field, and stopped at the water's edge. There was no hurry, no sign of panic. They lifted Lee from the vehicle, dragged him across rough ground, maneuvered him over a barbed wire fence, and placed him in the water. Then they left. The pathologist's findings confirmed what everyone later feared. Lee McKnight had not died from his injuries alone. He drowned. His body had been so extensively damaged that it couldn't resist the shallow water. He was alive when they put him in. At 23 minutes past 5 that morning, a farmer named Michael Irving followed a trail of tire tracks across his land, assuming someone had come to disturb his cattle overnight. Instead, he found a young man's body lying face down in the river shallows. The call went in, and Cumbria police arrived to a scene that would open one of the most brutal murder investigations the city had seen in years. Back on Charles Street, the house stood as a record of everything that had occurred inside it. Blood had soaked into the carpet, smeared across the kitchen tiles, and marked the walls and furniture throughout. Nobody reached for a phone to call for help. The priority now was removing themselves from what had happened. Jamie Lee Roberts was the first to act. He contacted his father, Paul Roberts, not to report the crime, but to dispose of the clothing he'd worn during the attack. Paul arrived and collected the items. They were burned and never recovered. A mobile phone was thrown into a street drain. Other items believed to be bloodied or otherwise incriminating were destroyed or scattered before daylight arrived. Carol Edgar's black Nissan Navara didn't stay nearby. It was driven out of Carlisle and left concealed in woodland, tucked beneath tree cover, still carrying the evidence of what it had been used for that night. The group did not flee the city. They returned to their own addresses, settled back into their routines, and behaved as though nothing had taken place. Coral Edgar deleted messages from her phone. The men closed off contact. No one sought medical attention. No one made a confession. The shared assumption appeared to be that silence would be enough, that if nobody talked, The trail would go cold, but they had left behind far more than they understood. Not just blood and fibers, but a digital and physical timeline connecting each of them to Charles Street, to the Navara, and to the riverbank. The truth had already begun to surface before any of them had time to fully process what they had done. From the moment Lee McKnight's body was pulled from the river, detectives treating the case understood immediately that this was organized violence. The extent of the injuries ruled out anything spontaneous. By mid-morning, Cumbria police had established a major incident response. Forensic teams worked the riverbank, the field, and the gate for tire impressions, clothing fibers, footwear marks, and any physical trace the group had left behind. Lee's movements that night were reconstructed quickly. CCTV had captured him boarding a taxi after 2:30 in the morning. The driver confirmed the destination, Charles Street. His phone signal dropped shortly after his arrival and was never picked up again. The address became the immediate focus of the investigation. When officers entered Coral Edgar's home, they walked into a scene that had not been cleaned. Blood had saturated the furniture. Drag marks crossed the floor. The diamante-handled riding whip had been left behind, still carrying biological material that would become central to the prosecution case. Neighbors, when questioned, admitted to having heard screaming during the night. Several described unusually loud music playing from the direction of the property, the kind of volume that seemed deliberate. A few had noticed movement through the windows, but had chosen not to call the police at the time. Days after the discovery, Carol Edgar's Nissan Navara was located abandoned in woodland outside Carlisle. It had not been cleaned. Inside, investigators recovered blood, fibers, and DNA linking it directly to the events on Charles Street and at the river. Arrests followed quickly across Carlisle. Jaime Davidson, Aaron Graham, Jamie Lee Roberts, Coral Edgar, Carol Edgar, and Paul Roberts were all taken into custody within days of the discovery. Their phones, when examined, revealed a network of coordination, messages sent before and after the attack that mapped out contact between individuals who had each claimed no knowledge of what the others had done. Digital forensics, CCTV analysis, and physical evidence combined to produce a timeline that the defense teams would spend 7 weeks attempting to dismantle at trial. The trial opened in the summer of 2021 at Carlisle Crown Court. Over 7 weeks, the jury heard a case built on forensic detail, phone data, witness testimony, and the contradictions that emerged as each of the 6 defendants attempted to explain their involvement in terms that placed the blame elsewhere. All 6 had entered not guilty pleas. None accepted that they had played a meaningful role in Lee's death. Jaime Davidson, from the dock, insisted that the violence had gone beyond anything he had planned. He pointed toward Jamie Lee Roberts as the person responsible for the worst of the assault, citing use of a knuckle duster. He denied having directed the killing itself. His phone activity and confirmed movements throughout that night told a different story to the jury. Jamie Lee Roberts responded in kind, describing Davidson in terms that left no room for ambiguity about the fear he claimed to have felt. He suggested he had been drawn into a situation he hadn't fully understood. CCTV footage and DNA evidence positioned him centrally in the attack. Aaron Graham denied being present in the house when Lee was beaten. The jury did not accept this account. Coral Edgar described herself as a frightened bystander. She told the court she had hidden during the assault and had only witnessed a single punch near the front door. She offered her mental health and her addiction as context for her behavior that night. Carol Edgar maintained she had not been present at the time of the attack and had not given permission for her vehicle to be used. The physical evidence linking her property and her Navara to the events of that night was substantial. Paul Roberts, who had collected and destroyed his son's clothing, told the court he had wanted to help Jamie Lee access medical assistance. He had instead burned the evidence and disappeared. After 27 hours of deliberation, the jury delivered its verdicts. All 6 defendants were found guilty of murder, some unanimously, some by majority, but the outcome was identical for each of them. On the 5th of July 2021, Judge Nicholas Hilliard addressed the court ahead of sentencing. He described what had taken place as a murder for gain. a premeditated act fueled by the logic of the drug trade and carried out with a level of cruelty that admitted no ambiguity. He told those in the dock that Lee McKnight had still been alive when they placed him in that water, and that they had done so knowing exactly what would follow. The courtroom was quiet as each sentence was handed down. Jaime Davidson, identified as the organizer of the attack, received a life sentence with a minimum term of 30 years. Aaron Graham, who had participated in the assault and assisted in transporting the body, was sentenced to life with a minimum of 26 years. Jamie Lee Roberts, who was 17 at the time of the murder and had struck Lee with a knuckle duster among other weapons, received a life sentence with a minimum term of 16 years and 12 months. Coral Edgar, whose messages had drawn Lee to Charles Street, was jailed for life with a minimum term of 13.5 years. Carol Edgar, who had provided the house and whose vehicle had been used to move Lee's body, received life with a minimum of 13 years. Paul Roberts, who had arrived after the attack to remove and destroy evidence, was sentenced to life with a minimum of 20.5 years. 6 people, 6 life sentences, and a family left to carry the weight of what was done to Lee McKnight on a quiet street in the early hours of a July morning, over a debt of £2,000 that was never going to be repaid. What do you think about the sentences handed down in this case? Were they sufficient given what took place that night? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you want to follow more true crime cases from across the UK, subscribe and turn on notifications. There is always another story to uncover.